Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to discuss with you one of the most important contemporary topics that one is hearing about in the United States today, and that is with cults. We often describe them as destructive cults, or another way of putting it is coping with cults. In order to accomplish that goal that we have set forth, it is my pleasure to welcome to our program a national expert on this topic. Our guest is Father Kent Bertner, who is at the present time with the Holy Family Cathedral in Anchorage, Alaska, of the Catholic faith. Father Bertner has a very impressive background dealing with this subject since 1969, and he has written materials and articles that have appeared in such publications as Parade and the 1980 edition of the World Book Encyclopedia. He's also worked with Boys Town Center in Nebraska concerning this subject. Father Bertner, it's kind of you to take time from a busy schedule and stop in our city to deal with this important topic.
Well, happy to be with you today.
And I'm happy to welcome to the panel to question our guest today. First of all, Idaho State Senator Mary Lou Reed. We also have Father Bill Wasmuth of the St. Pius Catholic Church in Coeur d'Alene, and also the president of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations. And we have Coeur d'Alene attorney Janelle Burke. And I shall ask Senator Reed to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Father Bertner, tell us a little bit about how you personally got involved with this whole issue of destructive cults. How did you get into it?
I got back in 1969. The secretary of our seminary came to me and said, "Have you ever heard of a group called the Unified Family? My daughter in college has gotten involved." And I hadn't heard of the Unified Family, and not a whole lot of other people had either. But I was invited to the family home for supper, and one thing led to another, and I got invited to a series of lectures at their center in Berkeley, California. And although I didn't join the group as they expected, they did tell me that I learned more about their ideology than anybody else outside the group. And they were really been terribly nice to me. Well, in December of 1971, their leader, Mr. Moon, came over from Korea, and the Unified Family became the Unification Church. And the explicit reason, as given by members of the group at that time, was that they had discovered Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code.
Yes, we know it well.
Yes,
right.
How that gives tax-exempt status to people in religion or education or other noble endeavors. And that was the beginning. We did some research on that group in the San Francisco Bay Area. We found out that they had at that time 65 front organizations that were there to either recruit people into the group or to get money for the organization. That was the beginning, and one thing sort of led to another.
Well, tell me, what is a destructive cult? I think you would put the Unification Church in, qualified as a destructive cult. What's the difference between a destructive cult and a constructive cult?
Well, let me say that when I use the word cult, I'm referring to a group that does two things. First of all, there's a question of honesty and truthfulness. That is to say, the group is not being upfront with regard to recruiting, with regard to money raising. They're not telling people where things are going and what they're going for. Or if you're getting recruited into the group, they're not telling you what you're really getting involved with. The bottom line information that a person would use to make an informed decision about whether or not to join is deliberately withheld until the person is perceived to be bonded closely enough to the group that giving them the information would not adversely affect their decision to join. And the second part of my concern is that these groups are also using severe and abusive forms of psychological and social influence control techniques that we would never condone, even in the most tightly structured of our social institutions. It is, as Dr. John Clark from Harvard University has said, the impermissible experiment. It's like taking someone to a psychological experiment here at NIC, but not telling them that it's an experiment or not telling them what the risks are. We're talking about things of an enormous order of magnitude.
And you would emphasize deliberate?
Oh, yes.
Intentionally
Absolutely.
Deceitful?
Yes, because they know that if they told you the truth, you wouldn't join. To give an example, if you went to Mr. Moon's group, and the first thing they told you is that unquestionably Mr. Moon is the Messiah, and that he's come to do what Jesus failed to do, and that in fact God means to rule the world through the hands of Mr. Moon.
You'd laugh.
you'd pack right out and go. Or with another group, the Church of Scientology. Scientology starts by passing out a free personality test, and you can analyze your glitches and what is it that you really need in your life. And of course, no matter how you answer the test, they've got a program that will exactly meet all those needs. And you go through an extensive period of so-called auditing or a kind of confessional counseling, as they like to describe it. But it leads you at a point where you learn, after having paid between $10,000 and $20,000 minimum, that 95 billion years ago, a guy in outer space named Xenu sent a bunch of frozen souls to planet Earth in a couple of spaceships. If you found out at the front door, instead of a personality test about Xenu, you probably wouldn't stay around very long. And they figured out that it works that way real well.
Father Bill Wassman.
The two qualities that you gave, or criteria or question marks that you have about groups, I guess. I want to expand on that a little bit if I could. I think there are something like 3,000 identifiable destructive cults in the country these days, some rather large like Unification Church, some very small with only a handful of members, and nobody knows the exact number, but there's plenty. So you can't know them all, no one person could. So it seems like the only way to face the issue is to know as well as possible the criteria of such groups. Could you expand a little bit on what you would look for in a group to identify them as destructive cult, or at least cause you to be somewhat concerned?
Yeah, I would send up flags if we had a leader of the group who was determining what truth is. I'd be very concerned looking at the behaviors of the group. What does it seem to be producing? What kind of contribution is it making to the society at large? What kind of goals does it say that it has, and what is it really doing to affect those goals? I'd be very concerned if I started finding out certain bits of information that the group was deliberately withholding. I would look at the way children were treated. I'd look at the way women were treated, because most of the cults tend to devalue women and children or elderly people as being useless assets. In a word, if someone came to me and said that they were interested in selling their group to me, I'd want to get lots of answers to good, tough questions and then go check them out someplace else. Then at the same time, I think it would be real important, having done that, to start a little bit of a research campaign that, if you were getting serious about the group now. Robert Lifton at Yale University was involved with helping people who came out of the prisoner of war camps from the North Korean conflict to the United Nations troops. And Lifton listed 8 areas of psychodynamics that identify totalist kinds of organizations. And when you get all 8 of those together, you have a group that makes it virtually impossible for the person to assert themselves over and against the group. So I would say a person in that regard then doesn't join a cult because they've made a conscious decision to join, that they've joined because every other door of choice has been closed to them in their perceptions, except this particular one.
I would like to pursue that a little bit more before I return to Janelle and have her series of questions. In reading some of your material, I was very impressed with the description that you gave, too, of the type of people that are persuaded to enter those cults. Mm-hmm. And you indicated, I believe, ages 15 to 25 seem to be the largest number of people that enter. And you indicated that people in that age group are going through some crises in their life, and you thought that made them more susceptible to influence. I'd appreciate it if you would, for our audience, would describe what some of those things are that you believe cause young people to be tempted to enter those cults.
Well, I think the people that are likely to join are people who have high ideals, who tend to be bright, who want to make a difference in the world they live in. And the problem is that every one of us goes through ups and downs in our life. Those are typical. And every once in a while we hit a down that's not working its way out just yet, and at that point some nice smiling person comes and is friendly to us. And no matter what it is that we do or what we're interested in, they've got something in their group that will really feed back into that interest. And we get invited for a dinner, or we get invited for a workshop on some topic of concern. We get invited to a Bible study, we get invited to learn meditation, we get invited to get all of the little glitches in our personality worked out. Every group has got some kind of a hook, and they get you on that basis. I mean, if someone came and said, come to my totalist organization where we will completely assume autonomy for your life and you won't get to make any decisions anymore and we will run everything and you don't get to make any choices, not too many people are likely to show up. But if you said, hey, how would you like to know more about God? How would you like to be able to make friends? How would you like to make the world real good? I mean, those are all neat things, and we'd all like to partake in those. Now, I picked that younger age group because typically those are the folks that don't have as much life experience, and when they get into lows, they don't quite know how to handle them. I don't think young people know that depression is probably the most common emotion there is. At least if you sit in the rectory and listen to people's anxieties and hurts, why, you know that that's a common event. But you also know, having been around a little while, that you get out of those things too, that there are concrete good ways to work yourself through them. So young people tend to be more vulnerable because they have more of those things to go through. But many of the groups pick up older people as well, people in their middle age or people, even elderly folks. If you lose a spouse, or you've had some upsetting thing at work, or you've lost your job, or a child runs away, or you have some conflict that you can't resolve easily, those are hard things. And oftentimes these groups will offer seminars in something that's your professional interest, and you go to the seminar, and you may not have been in a crisis when you went to the seminar, but the seminar is set up to make sure that you have one so they can pick up on it. So either way, you're likely to get recruited that way as well.
Janelle Berg.
You have called the cults destructive cults. So can you tell us, how are they destructive toward A, society, and B, toward the individual who becomes a member of a destructive cult? How do they really harm us? How are they dangerous to us?
I think the bottom line danger, if you will, for the individual is that you lose your ability to make choices. That all of the issues that you deal with in your life have been reduced to simple formula that the group is telling you. You've given up the one thing, your free will, which makes you human. And that, to me, is an awful tragedy. We've seen the effects of that in things like the horrible massacre at Jonestown. Mm-hmm. We saw the political cult move in Philadelphia get things going. Whether or not they handled it well on the part of the city, we saw a whole neighborhood destroyed and lives lost. We've seen child abuse. We've seen a whole list of human tragedies related to the fact that people have completely surrendered their ability to make choices to some individual that claims some divine or other special gift that he or she can run their lives. So my answer really kind of bled over into the social problems. If you consider that cults as a whole do not believe that the law and order that we ultimately believe in is really God-inspired or comes from the right place, that they've got a better program, they tend to become antinomian. That is to say, the law doesn't matter. Their own law, their own internal understanding is really the right thing. And while that doesn't mean that every cult is going to do everything illegally, what it does mean is that there's lots of doors open to deceive people. For instance, the Unification Church has been a marvelous instrument in giving that kind of thing. We've seen the little flower sellers coming door to door. Dr. Mose Durst was in Anchorage on a radio talk show not more than a few months ago, and he announced that the mobile fundraising teams, that they're called, had been disbanded almost a year before. But he had real hard trouble when I called them up and asked him why there were 3 Moonies at the door selling stuff just 3 weeks before he was on the radio. They've told us that those things have been abandoned several times now. It's kind of hard to believe them. They've set up wonderful front groups up in Fairbanks. We had a case where 6 evangelical ministers were invited and accepted invitations to fly down to Denver, Colorado. And let me tell you, when it's minus 50 degrees in Fairbanks, going any place sounds real good, even if there's snow in Colorado. All expense-paid trip for an organization called Causa. And it was an organization said to be concerned about the infiltration of Marxism and Marxist political philosophy, especially in Latin America. And they were going to offer a critique and a counter-proposal of this wonderful seminar. One thing the 2 people that recruited all these folks failed to mention is that the man and his associate were the state director and assistant director of the State Unification Church, and none of the folks that they signed up even knew that this was a Moon-sponsored organization. Things like Causa and some of the other front groups that these cults have set up serve to try and get people to believe that their organization is really a credible event. We're just like the folks next door. The deception, the incredible amounts of money flowing in and around, and the illegal activities that the groups engage in are things that they don't want seen, but they want to look like somebody who's doing some positive service. Like Causa, in another way, the Moonies have an organization called Project Volunteer down in the Bay Area and a few of the major cities. The idea is that they go around and collect surplus food commodities. And they do that, and they distribute surplus food to the poor. What they don't tell you is that the food goes to a warehouse, it's sorted out, the good stuff goes to their centers, and then what's left gets distributed. So there's a whole series of things like that that are basically PR ploys or attempts, to me, and this is more sinister, attempts to manipulate our whole public policy. Mr. Moon said in a speech in 1974 that he intended to have his own CIA. And you know what? I think he's got it. He started at an expense of now a loss of over $60 million. The Washington Times, a really big conservative newspaper in Washington, D.C., run at a terrible loss, but it's even being quoted now by conservative members of our own government who see this as a spokesman for their ideology. Mr. Moon now has 140 accredited reporters all throughout the world that can walk in with their press pass. Moon has got, now what does Moon need with the CIA? Because he has been for many, many years linked with the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. He and the Koreans are playing stroke each other's back. He's been a political survivor in Korea for many, many years with political re-education programs. He worked under the Park regime with an anti-communist program. When the Chung regime came along, the program was shifted to do political re-education for that regime. And guess what? He's running the same programs over in this country. He calls it causa, but it's the same basic idea. And the bottom line is there's a critique and there's a counter-proposal, but what people who go to these things, who accept Mr. Moon's money and his favors, don't know is that that at the same time they're buying into a program that says that God's counter-proposal for communism is that Mr. Moon should rule the world.
Mary Lou Reed.
These things are very hard to believe.
I wish I didn't have to believe them, but I've got the darn documents sitting on my files, so, and many other people do. I'm not the only source of this information.
Well, how do
certainly.
they justify this deception and manipulation to themselves? These people come in as young idealists, and then they are converted somehow into, is it power, is it greed, money, or are they just, how does the programming take effect?
Well, it depends on where you are in the organization. Now, certainly with regard to the leadership of, say, Moon's group or others, I'm quite sure that I've never met a poor cult leader, or at least every cult leader I've heard of does a lot better than the members of his or her group. But I don't think the bottom line is money. Take, for example, David Moses Berg, the leader of the Children of God. On any number of occasions, on his word, 4,000 people will fast for periods of a day to weeks. That's an incredible power trip. I mean, any husband or wife who's realized that they've got a couple of buttons they can push in their spouse to make sure they get their way is playing a kind of power game. But we're talking about a power game that's monumental, especially when some of the bigger cults are linked with international politics. So the power, I think, is the bottom line for the people on top. For the people down at the bottom, the world is divided very, very clearly into God or Satan, good or bad. The people outside are either satanic or they're heartistic. They're either raw meat or they're on the program in some way. And if you're trying to, if you're recently gotten into the group and you're trying to help the world get better, well, what do? I mean, do you work by the satanic ethics or do you work by our group's godly ethics? And our group's godly ethics are much higher. So if you go to sell something to a person and they give you money, even if they think it's going to help educate people for anti-communism, what they don't know is that it's really gone to Mr. Moon's heavenly kingdom. And you've done them two favors. Because on one hand, you've gotten God's money out of Satan's hand over to God's side, and better than that, you've established a foundation for that person to be returned to God, because it was his buck before it got in there. So that's easy to rationalize. The people, I think, who are in the hardest spots are the one in the middle-level management of these groups, because they orchestrate this thing day after day. And in some way they see it, but I think they have to rationalize it to themselves and say, well, it's either God or nothing, because their own choices have been so constricted at that point. It has to be that way, even though I don't like it. There's no other way. There's a lack of choice there. Then there are others, I think, who do very well. A man who was close to Dr. Durst back in Berkeley, Durst is the American head of Unification Church, said that the way to deprogram Dr. Durst would be to give him a job with a $500,000 a year salary, an expensive mansion, and a Cadillac with a chauffeur. That would deprogram Durst rather easily. But many of the young people in cults that we've worked with have earned, in the few years of their cult activities, they brought in more money than their parents may have in their entire lifetime. And when you sit back, you look at those things, and you sort of say, well, gosh, maybe that's something important to stay here for. You may have more perks than you would out in the world. Inside a cult, you've got maybe just a few hundred or a few thousand members, but you're the elite core that's going to save the world. And if you come back out, you're one of us 220 million schmucks, just like everybody else. That's a hard transition for somebody to make.
Father Bill.
You said the sales teams for the Unification Church have been disbanded. There's been 3 different groups within the last couple of months in Coeur d'Alene that we're aware of. One selling teddy bears, one selling bamboo things with print on them. So it's not a distant sort of thing from us at all. It's very close to home.
I can understand that. The mobile fundraising teams at one point were good for $20 million a year for Mr. Moon's organization.
And they're out and alive. Yeah. They're out and alive right in our area. Don't want to create panic with our presentations this evening or with your information, and I don't think it need be either, because even though it's a serious kind of concern, on the other hand, it's not something that we need to arm ourselves about. But what can communities do? What can parents do? What can communities do to do positive things in reaction to the presence of destructive cults in our country rather than negative?
The one word I would use is awareness. We need to educate ourselves. You and I and most of our kids have grown up thinking that there's a nice world out there. And I think the world is basically pretty good. I think the people in the world are basically pretty good. But what we've never told people is that there's a bunch of sharks in those waters, and that the sharks have got hidden agendas, and they're out to get you. Now that's a hard thing to realize. It's a hard thing to deal with. But, very few cults have people from ghettos in them, because folks who grow up in the ghettos can spot a con coming at 20 yards. We have to make our kids a little bit streetwise. I would like a unit in every senior high school curriculum on vehicles of mind abuse. And we don't have to talk religion. We don't have to talk cults. We can just talk about techniques to assume control over another person's autonomy. I would start with that right there. In my own parish, the Upper Division Religious Education Program has got a unit of cults, which I teach myself. But now there are some very good curricula that have been written, so you don't have to have an expert hanging around to do this. There's lots of good material available to people. So the educational thing, I think, is the foremost thing. If people know that there are groups out there and active, if for instance, there's a cult awareness center active here in Coeur d'Alene, if people keep in touch with that information, they're going to avoid themselves being conned. And people are getting conned all over the place. I've heard that you've had some legislators that have gone off to a Causa weekend. I honestly think that any legislature, and this is my opinion, I don't want to get your station in trouble, but I think that any legislature who would go off on a Causa weekend is utterly in contempt of his public trust. This is a very, very foolish thing to do. At the same time, if the information's not there, if people don't know what's out there, what's looking for them, if they don't know that these groups want respectability, if they don't know that their money or their facilities or their businesses might be being co-opted along the way, then you don't blame them for their ignorance. But somebody's got to say the word, and somebody's got to take that information around.
Janelle Burke.
I want to ask a series of little questions, and there's sort of words that may call to your mind something, and please feel free to expand on them.
Sure.
First of all, at what point does a person become obsessed with the cult, or does the obsession happen after the cult finally gets into their mind, so to speak?
I think it's a gradual process. People in this field have told me that it's possible to cook a frog without the frog ever knowing he's being cooked. You take a nice, lively frog and you put him in a pan of cool water, and he just loves it. And very gradually you put the heat on and bring the temperature up just a little bit at a time. And before you know it, the frog is sitting in the pan, the water's boiling, and he's got a big smile on his face because he doesn't know he's getting cooked. And the way people get involved in cults is really the same sort of thing. You don't walk in the front door and zap, you're done in. But bit by bit, you get people to lower their defenses, you get them to start trusting, and then you get them to believe that in some way their own thoughts or their ability to analyze what you're telling them is not really adequate to the task, that somehow their own life experience won't really provide them with the criteria that they need in order to make a good judgment about what's going on. This is a whole new body of information. It's scientific, it's comprehensive, and so what that means is they have to depend on the group in order to make an evaluation. And the group will give them some tools to evaluate the doctrine, the content, and the behaviors of the group. The second thing that goes on, and I think this is really the bottom line, is that you get people to feel that their own feelings are moral actions for which they're responsible. That is to say, you and I know from our life experience, or psychologists know from their study of psychology, even moral theologians know that your feelings are morally neutral. It's what you do with them that makes it good or bad. For instance, if I sat here and went on at great length and nobody got a chance to talk, and finally somebody got up and punched my lights out, well, that probably wouldn't be a very creative way to deal with their anger. But if you said, hey, look, Father Kent, you're going on, you've got to cut this back, this is making our program into a monologue, well, then we'd have something to talk about, and you could work out your anger in a very positive sort of way. But if I could get you to believe that your feelings, any feelings, whether it was anger or a sexual feeling or being tired after 19 hours of fundraising, if I could get you to believe that any of those feelings were moral actions for which you're responsible, then the next feeling you're going to get is guilt. You're going to feel enormously guilty, because I'm going to target normal feelings that everybody has. It's part of our God-given equipment, if you will. And if I can make you feel guilty for that, then of course you can come back to me to find out how not to feel guilty anymore. And then I've got you into my program. And my program is going to continue the guilt mechanism. It's going to introduce thought reform techniques. It's going to do behavior modification, all those little things that we know that we can use to influence people in one way or another. And by golly, when you've done that, the person is in. Now, at what point does it happen? I'm not sure that you can say. I know that some people have talked about a kind of snapping experience when all of a sudden, ooh, my gosh, I got it. And other people just sort of gradually drift in. And the same, some drift out the same way.
And so the obsession then results in a giving up of our property. It results in a separation from our friends and other family that does not follow the same particular kinds of beliefs that we have.
Yeah.
And so then I assume that at some point the cult becomes the answer to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't have to deal with politics anymore. Just get more members in the group and get more money in the group. You don't have to deal with human relationships anymore. Just get more money and more members. And the group will mediate all of these other things for you. It's a rather simplistic way to look at life. It's comfortable. Have you ever met a glum-looking cultie? I mean, they may have been exhausted, and every bit of their body language may have portrayed that they were unhappy, but they've got this plastic smile woven into their face because they've got what appears to be a solution to a really awful world out there. And of course, the world looks more and more awful the longer you sit in the group.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we're out of time. On behalf of our staff and the panel, Father Kent, thank you for coming. You've been most informative, and you lived up to your expertise that we heard about, and we appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Father Kent Bertner, who is with the Holy Family Catholic Cathedral in Anchorage, Alaska, and as I've indicated at the beginning of the program, he truly is an expert on destructive cults, and he's been talking about how to cope with cults. And as I've indicated to you at the beginning of the program, he's been published in such things as the 1980 edition of the World Book Encyclopedia. I hope you've enjoyed our program and that you will be with us again next week at the same time when we'll discuss an important subject. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.